Киева лежат в одной плоскости с санкционированными им террористическими нападениями на российские иностранные танкеры в международных водах Средиземного и Черного морей. Кого-нибудь в Совете Безопасности интересует свобода и безопасность коммерческого судоходства в этом контексте? Господин председатель, становится все более очевидным, что нынешние украинские власти не заинтересованы ни в мирных переговорах, ни даже в элементарных гуманитарных шагах, которые могли бы облегчить страдания людей. При этом это проявляется не на словах, а в конкретных действиях, или точнее бездействии. Простой пример. До сих пор в городе Сумы удерживаются 7 гражданских лиц, насильно вывезенных из Курской области. Это не военнослужащие, не участники боевых действий, а обычные мирные жители, оказавшиеся заложниками произвола Киева. Зато при обсуждении обмена военнопленными украинская сторона в первую очередь настаивает на возвращении радикальных боевиков нацбатальона «Азов», тогда как судьба обычных мобилизованных мужчин, зачастую оказавшихся на фронте против своей воли, отходит на второй план. Это красноречиво свидетельствует о системе приоритетов киевского режима. То, как на Украине ведется мобилизация, уже невозможно скрыть ни за громкими лозунгами, ни за внешней риторикой. Системная, масштабная и принудительная кампания все меньше напоминает мобилизацию в классическом понимании и все больше превращается в охоту и отлов людей. Кадры, распространяемые в соцсетях, говорят сами за себя. Сотрудники крадут людей на улицах, с рабочих мест, вытаскивают из общественного транспорта. При этом так называемая система брони, призванная защитить отдельные категории специалистов от призыва, на практике превращена в коррупционный фильтр. У кого есть деньги или связи, тот защищен, остальные отправляются на передовую. Все это создает внутри общества опасный разлом, где одни воспринимаются как некая высшая каста, другие как расходный материал. И это не просто моральная проблема, а стратегический тупик. Ведь армия, построенная на принуждении и страхе, не может быть боеспособной. В этом контексте понятно, почему киевская верхушка боится реальных переговоров. Серьезный дипломат поставит вопрос, ради чего были принесены все эти жертвы, почему не были использованы возможности для урегулирования. Президент России неоднократно подтверждал, что мы однозначно привержены переговорному решению и достижению цели СВО дипломатическими методами. Но поскольку киевский режим к этому не готов и наускиваемый своими европейскими друзьями собирается продолжать воевать любой ценой, ему уже вскоре придется столкнуться с регулированием. Благодарю вас.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
President, Deputy Secretary of State, we welcome you presiding over this session. And I would also like to thank USG DeCarlo and USG Fletcher for their briefings. The conflict in Ukraine, now in its 5th year, has exacted a heavy cost on all those affected: peoples, their livelihoods, economies, entire countries, entire regions, and beyond. Its prolonged nature has deepened divisions, strained multilateralism, and complicated efforts towards a peaceful resolution. The humanitarian dimension in particular is tragic. As highlighted in the 2 briefings, civilians continue to bear the brunt of hostilities, with loss of life, displacement, and destruction of homes and infrastructure. The continued human suffering underscores the urgent need to uphold human dignity, ensure protection of civilians, and prioritize a peaceful settlement of this conflict. President, from the very first days of this conflict, Pakistan has stood on the side of dialogue and diplomacy. And we remain convinced that there is no military solution to this conflict, and that a just and lasting peace can only be achieved through sustained, structured, and meaningful dialogue. We advocated our support for dialogue T22 when the two sides engaged in Istanbul, and we have continued to support all subsequent peace initiatives, including Security Council Resolution 2774 of February last year, and the ongoing negotiation process facilitated by the United States. Regrettably, the unfolding of another totally avoidable crisis in the Middle East has also interrupted the negotiation process on Ukraine. We, however, hope that the next round of these negotiations would take place at the earliest, and that all parties would continue their efforts for peace, demonstrate genuine political will, build mutual understanding, and engage constructively to achieve a negotiated settlement of the conflict, beginning with an immediate cessation of hostilities. Bringing a lasting peace would require firm commitment to the principles and purposes of the UN and a focus on finding a mutually acceptable solution that corresponds to the respective positions and legitimate security interests of all sides. Pakistan will continue to support all initiatives aimed at bridging the divides and promoting pacific settlement of conflicts globally, Ukraine or elsewhere, always upholding international law and in full respect of the UN Charter principles. Pakistan therefore reiterates its call for restraint, de-escalation, and the resolution of all disputes through dialogue and diplomacy. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Liberia.
Mr. President, Liberia welcomes you and thanks the briefers for sobering updates. As we have heard, we meet today against the backdrop of a conflict whose humanitarian consequences continue to deepen, particularly through the widespread destruction of infrastructure essential to civilian survival. The destruction of energy systems, water networks, and basic services, especially under winter conditions, has compounded the vulnerability of millions and underscores the urgency of a more focused and outcome-oriented response from this Council. Liberia calls on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and to act in full compliance with their obligations under international law. At the same time, the Security Council continues to engage this issue with notable regularity, including through monthly meetings. While such sustained attention is necessary, Liberia observes that this consistency of engagement has yet to translate at scale into measurable progress toward a cessation of hostilities, nor has it yielded a clearly articulated and credible pathway toward peace. We raise this observation mindful of the complexity of the situation, but also conscious that the Council must continually assess whether its methods of engagement are aligned with the objective of influencing outcomes on the ground. In this regard, Liberia is of the view that the Council must guard against a situation where it remains actively seized of the matter in form, but less effective in advancing conditions for resolution in substance. The value of our engagement must ultimately be measured by its contribution to de-escalation and to a viable political horizon. Against this backdrop, Liberia wishes to highlight several considerations. The protection of civilians must remain paramount. Previous speakers have made this point, and over the last 4 years continue to do so. Attacks affecting infrastructure indispensable to civilian survival, including energy, water, and healthcare systems, should be assessed not only in isolation, but in light of their cumulative and cascading humanitarian impact. All parties must fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law, including with respect to the treatment of prisoners of war. In this regard, Liberia notes with concern issues raised in recent briefings, including serious concerns highlighted by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Such matters, where substantiated, must be addressed through appropriate and impartial processes consistent with international law. Reports of violations affecting civilians and detained persons further underscore the importance of upholding accountability and reinforcing the normative framework governing armed conflict. At the same time, the Council's engagement must increasingly be guided by the imperative of achieving tangible progress. Liberia encourages the identification of practical, incremental steps that can contribute to de-escalation and help build confidence toward a broader political resolution. Closely linked to this is the need to advance a realistic and clearly defined pathway toward peace, as the absence of such a framework continue to risk leaving ongoing efforts reactive rather than strategic. Liberia also believes it will be a matter of concern if the Council were to conclude its engagement on this issue, having maintained it on the agenda without demonstrable movement toward a resolution. Sustained attention must translate into meaningful impact. We further note, with concern, reports regarding the movement and relocation of children in the context of the conflict. This is an issue that warrants continued attention and careful examination in future briefings, given its serious humanitarian and legal implications. In conclusion, Mr. President, Liberia remains convinced that there is no military solution to this conflict. We therefore support renewed diplomatic engagement aimed at achieving a much-needed ceasefire and a political settlement consistent with the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. We encourage this Council to match the regularity of its engagement with a renewed emphasis on strategic direction and measurable outcomes. A Council that meets consistently must also move the needle, because being seized of a matter is not, in itself, a substitute for progress toward peace. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the representative of Liberia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Secrétaire d'État adjoint des États-Unis d'Amérique, Monsieur Christopher Orlando, nous vous saluons et nous vous souhaitons la bienvenue parmi nous. La République démocratique du Congo salue la convocation de cette réunion qui nous permet de poursuivre nos échanges sur la situation en Ukraine à la lumière des développements récents. Nous tenons à remercier Madame Rosemary DiCarlo ainsi que Monsieur Tom Fletcher, respectivement secrétaire général adjoint des Nations Unies aux affaires politiques et aux affaires humanitaires, pour leurs exposés. Monsieur le Président, La République démocratique du Congo demeure prof des hostilités et leurs conséquences dramatiques sur les populations civiles. Comme nous l'avons souligné lors de notre précédente intervention, la détérioration de la situation humanitaire nous rappelle que derrière les dynamiques du conflit se trouvent avant tout des vies humaines, des familles et des communautés entières plongées dans la souffrance. Il est impératif de mettre un terme aux hostilités et de veiller au respect strict de tout engagement en faveur d'un cessez-le-feu. En effet, seule une cessation effective des combats permettra de réduire durablement les souffrances des populations civiles et de prévenir une aggravation de la situation humanitaire. À cet égard, bien qu'il n'y ait eu d'amélioration concrète sur le terrain, la République démocratique du Congo note tout de même avec intérêt les signaux encourageants observés à la mi-février en faveur d'une reprise des efforts diplomatiques. Nous exhortons donc toutes les parties à privilégier la voie du dialogue et à redoubler d'efforts pour consolider un cessez-le-feu effectif, durable et crédible. Monsieur le Président, le respect du droit international humanitaire et la protection des civils doivent demeurer des priorités constantes en temps de conflit. À cet égard, la République démocratique du Congo rappelle la nécessité de garantir un accès humanitaire sûr, rapide et sans entrave à toutes les personnes dans le besoin. Les acteurs humanitaires doivent pouvoir intervenir dans des conditions de sécurité adéquates afin de répondre efficacement aux besoins urgents des populations affectées. Nous réitérons également notre vive préoccupation face aux attaques visant des infrastructures civiles, en particulier les installations énergétiques, dont la dégradation affecte directement les conditions de vie des populations et compromet leur accès aux services essentiels. Monsieur le Président, la République démocratique du Congo tient à rappeler que ce conflit continue également à avoir des répercussions bien au-delà de son théâtre immédiat. En effet, la poursuite du conflit en Ukraine aggrave les vulnérabilités économiques et alimentaires déjà existantes et pèse lourdement sur les populations les plus fragiles. Cette situation contribue notamment à perturber les chaînes d'approvisionnement en céréales et en biens de première nécessité, affectant de manière disproportionnée les pays africains fortement dépendants des importations. Monsieur le Président, pour conclure, la République démocratique du Congo demeure attachée aux principes de la Charte des Nations Unies, notamment le règlement pacifique des différends, le respect de la souveraineté et de l'intégralité territoriale des États. Nous demeurons convaincus qu'une paix véritablement durable et juste ne pourra être atteinte que par l'exploration des voies diplomatiques, prenant pleinement en compte les causes profondes de la crise. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of the DRC for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，我感谢迪卡洛副秘书长和弗莱彻副秘书长所做的通报。乌克兰危机持续延宕，是包括中方在内的各方都不愿看到的。年初以来，围绕乌克兰问题的各种对话密集推进，中方对此表示欢迎。谈判桌是和平的起点，虽然当前谈判势头有所放缓，但只要坚持谈下去，就一定能找到解决问题的办法，打开通向和平的大门。自危机爆发以来，中方始终坚持劝和促谈，推动危机政治解决。习近平主席提出的4个应该，是中国处理乌克兰问题的根本遵循。我们认为，各国主权、领土完整都应该得到尊重，联合国宪章宗旨和原则都应该得到遵守，各国合理安全关切都应该得到重视，一切有利于和平解决危机的努力都应该得到支持。针对最新形势发展，中方愿强调：第一，要确保各方平等参与，筑牢和平基础。危机延续至今，涉及的矛盾错综复杂，牵扯的利益攸关方，中方支持各当事方和利益攸关方都参与到和谈进程中，在对话中求同存异，在谈判中积累共识，共同朝着政治解决危机、实现持久和平的方向努力。 第二，要确保照顾各方合理关切，增强和平意愿。俄罗斯、乌克兰两国比邻而居，需要的是善意，而不是仇恨，是相互尊重，而不是对立对抗。中方鼓励俄乌双方从本民族根本和长远利益出发，照顾彼此合理关切，争取早日达成全面、持久、有约束力的和平协议。第三，要确保实现共同安全，构建持久和平架构。乌克兰危机的本质是欧洲安全矛盾的总爆发，是安全赤字和信任赤字长期积累、不断恶化的结果。相关各方应从危机中汲取教训，秉持安全不可分割原则，推动构建均衡、有效、可持续的地区安全架构，实现欧洲长治久安。主席，冲突、战争没有赢家，军事手段带不来持久和平。早日停火止战，寻求政治解决是唯一可行之道。中方将继续秉持客观公正立场，致力于劝和促谈，同有关各方保持接触沟通，为政治解决危机做出不懈努力。谢谢。
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Agradecemos que nos distinga su excelencia al presidir esta reunión. Acogemos con atención las palabras de la señora Rosemary Di Carlo, secretaria general adjunta, y respaldamos nuevamente su firme llamado a un alto al fuego inmediato como paso esencial para aliviar el sufrimiento de la población civil y avanzar hacia una solución pacífica de este conflicto. Asimismo, agradecemos al señor Tom Fletcher, secretario general adjunto de Asuntos Humanitarios y coordinador del Socorro de Emergencia, por su detallada y puntual exposición sobre la situación en el terreno. Reconocemos la asistencia de las distinguidas delegaciones que nos acompañan en sala. Panamá observa con profunda preocupación cómo la actual superposición de conflictos en un contexto geopolítico cada vez más volátil compromete la capacidad de respuesta de la comunidad internacional y de este Consejo, y además genera consecuencias devastadoras para los civiles, quienes en su gran mayoría terminan soportando el peso de los enfrentamientos. Esta preocupante tendencia global se refleja en el contexto de Ucrania, donde la crisis humanitaria continúa deteriorándose de manera sostenida. Según informes de Naciones Unidas, el uso creciente de armas de largo alcance, incluidos misiles y drones, ha incrementado el riesgo para la población civil, y los ataques a la infraestructura energética han agravado las condiciones de vida, particularmente durante este último invierno. El año 2025 fue el más mortífero para las poblaciones civiles de los beligerantes desde el inicio de las hostilidades, con al menos 2.514 personas fallecidas y más de 12.000 heridas. Esto refleja un incremento alarmante del 31% en las víctimas civiles de las partes respecto al año anterior. Más de 10 millones de personas requieren asistencia humanitaria, mientras que una cifra similar ha sido desplazada, incluyendo 3.7 millones de desplazados internos y cerca de 6 millones de refugiados en el exterior. Este desplazamiento masivo no solo genera presión sobre los países vecinos, sino que también crea condiciones de vulnerabilidad extrema para quienes se ven obligados a abandonar sus hogares. La resolución 2774, adoptada en 2025, expresa de manera inequívoca la voluntad de este Consejo como garante de la paz y seguridad internacionales y reafirma la necesidad de poner fin a la guerra de manera inmediata. Panamá reitera la urgencia de retomar con prioridad los esfuerzos diplomáticos a poner fin a este conflicto y reitera su llamado a que las partes involucradas mantengan la voluntad política de un diálogo constante y constructivo que bajo los principios consagrados en la Carta de las Naciones Unidas encuentre una salida definitiva a este prolongado conflicto. Sin esa voluntad política de ambas partes, cualquier esfuerzo de este Consejo desde una perspectiva práctica y realista será inútil. Gracias, presidente.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG DiCarlo and USG Fletcher for their comprehensive briefing. As this conflict continues, my delegation remains profoundly concerned by the continued deterioration of both security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine, which have now entered a difficult chapter. The ongoing hostilities serve only to prolong human suffering and further diminish the prospect for a sustainable peace. We are troubled by the continued escalations affecting civilian and civilian infrastructure. The protection of civilians, particularly the most vulnerable, and the preservation of schools, hospitals, and homes are non-negotiable obligations enshrined in international humanitarian law. Somalia reiterates that all parties must prioritize de-escalation, exercise utmost restraint, and uphold the aforementioned principles without exception. In this spirit, we welcome the significant prisoner of war exchange completed on March 6 between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Such humanitarian milestones serve as essential confidence-building measures and remind us that amidst deep division, cooperation remains possible. Mr. President, we remain convinced that there is no military solution to this protracted conflict. Dialogue and diplomacy remain the sole viable measures to bring this crisis to an end. In this regard, we note with encouragement the ongoing international diplomatic initiatives and welcome the trilateral talks led by the United States. While the next phase of these talks planned in March have been postponed, we look forward to their resumption to ensure these diplomatic tracks continue their momentum toward a resolution to this conflict. These engagements represent a vital step toward a de-escalation, and we hope they will lay the ground for a constructive and durable path forward. A lasting and just resolution must address the underlying root causes of this conflict and be fully consistent with the purpose and the principles of the United Nations Charter. In closing, Mr. President, my delegation reaffirms its unwavering support for all diplomatic efforts aimed at achieving a resolution that restores peace, security, and stability in the region. The Ukrainian people and all those affected by this conflict deserve peace, prosperity, and dignity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Colombia.
Gracias, señor presidente, por convocar esta sesión. Extiendo también mi agradecimiento a la subsecretaria general para Asuntos Políticos y de Consolidación de Paz de Naciones Unidas, así como al secretario general adjunto de Asuntos Humanitarios y coordinador del Socorro de Emergencia de las Naciones Unidas por sus reportes, y saludo a las delegaciones que nos acompañan en la sesión de hoy. Nos encontramos ante un conflicto prolongado cuyo impacto más devastador recae de manera constante e inaceptable sobre la población civil. El balance es claro y profundamente desesperanzador. Vidas perdidas, familias desplazadas, comunidades fracturadas y generaciones enteras marcadas por la incertidumbre. Las zonas urbanas continúan siendo un escenario de hostilidades que afectan a la población y a la infraestructura crítica indispensable para la supervivencia cotidiana, sistema de energía, agua, salud y transporte. Los ataques contra objetos e infraestructura civil son una amenaza directa a la vida y a la dignidad. Hospitales que no pueden operar, escuelas cerradas y hogares sin calefacción en pleno invierno. Estas no son consecuencias colaterales inevitables, son realidades inaceptables que Colombia rechaza categóricamente y que deben ser la prioridad de este Consejo. Además, las violencias basadas en género en el contexto del conflicto, incluyendo la violencia sexual, sigue siendo motivo de profunda preocupación. Condenamos enfáticamente todos los actos de esta naturaleza, independientemente de quien los cometa, y recordamos que constituyen una violación al derecho internacional. Instamos a todas las partes a prevenir, investigar y sancionar estos crímenes, garantizar la protección de las víctimas y sobrevivientes y asegurar su acceso a la justicia y a la rendición de cuentas. Las víctimas civiles de esta guerra no merecen más sufrimiento. Es urgente promover medidas concretas para atender su situación. No podemos permitir que la inercia sustituya a la responsabilidad. Señor presidente, es imperativo que todas las partes respeten y aseguren el respeto al derecho internacional humanitario. Lo anterior incluye la obligación de garantizar en todo momento un trato humano y digno a los prisioneros de guerra, asegurando condiciones adecuadas de detención, acceso a asistencia médica, contacto con sus familias y provisión absoluta de la tortura y de cualquier forma de trato cruel, inhumano o degradante. Al mismo tiempo, es fundamental impulsar y profundizar los canales de diálogo, procurando dotarlos de una dinámica continua y previsible que favorezca avances graduales y concretos. En este sentido, Colombia alienta a las partes a mantener un esfuerzo constante y agradece la labor de todos los mediadores que han permitido trabajar hacia la paz. Instamos a todas las partes a redoblar los esfuerzos diplomáticos y a no desfallecer en los intentos de lograr un acuerdo serio y verificable, bajo los principios de buena fe y conforme a la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. La historia demuestra que incluso en los contextos más complejos, el diálogo sigue siendo la única vía para reducir el sufrimiento y construir una salida sostenible y justa. A su vez, Colombia desea subrayar también el grave peligro que representa la escalada en torno a instalaciones nucleares. La mera posibilidad de incidente en estos entornos conlleva riesgos catastróficos, no solo para Ucrania, sino para la región y el mundo. Es indispensable garantizar su seguridad, demilitarización y supervisión adecuada. Señor presidente, es tiempo de terminar con esta guerra. Cada día que pasa sin avances hacia la desescalada y la negociación es un día más de sufrimiento para miles de civiles. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Colombia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. بداية أود أن أرحب بالسيد كريستوفر لانداو نائب وزير الخارجية بالولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، كما أشكر السيدة روزماري دي كارلو وكيل الأمين العام للشؤون السياسية وبناء السلام، والسيد توم فلاتشر وكيل الأمين العام للشؤون الإنسانية ومنسق الإغاثة فرع على إحاطتهما للمجلس اليوم. السيد الرئيس، تمتد آثار النزاعات المسلحة بشكل متزايد على المدنيين، حيث تؤدي إلى خسائر بشرية وتدمير البنية التحتية الحيوية، مما يعيق توفير الخدمات الأساسية بما في ذلك خدمات الكهرباء والماء والتدفئة، فضلاً عن تأثيرها على الاقتصاد العالمي وإمدادات الطاقة، ناهيك عن التأثير النفسي العميق لهذه النزاعات على المدنيين. وقد أسفرت الحرب الأوكرانية الروسية في عام 2025 عن مقتل ما لا يقل عن 2500 مدنياً وإصابة أكثر من 12,000 آخرين، وهي الأعداد الأعلى منذ اندلاع الأزمة عام 2022. ونود في هذا الصدد التطرق إلى النقاط الثلاث التالية. أولاً، تؤكد مملكة البحرين على أهمية الالتزام بالقانون الدولي، وذلك يشمل القانون الدولي الإنساني ومقاصد ميثاق الأمم المتحدة واحترام سيادة الدول وسلامتها الإقليمية وعدم التدخل في شؤونها الداخلية وتعزيز علاقات حسن الجوار بما يتسق مع المادة الثانية من الميثاق. ثانياً، تحذر مملكة البحرين من الاستخدام المفرط للأسلحة في النزاعات التي تعرض حياة المدنيين للخطر وتلحق الضرر بالمنشآت المدنية والحيوية، لا سيما مع الارتفاع الحاد في استخدام الصواريخ الباليستية والطائرات المسيرة من أي جانب كان وفي أي نزاع. وتشير مفوضية الأمم المتحدة السامية لحقوق الإنسان إلى الازدياد الملحوظ في سقوط ضحايا مدنيين جراء هجمات قصيرة المدى بطائرات بدون طيار، حيث ارتفعت الخسائر المدنية الناجمة عن الطائرات بدون طيار قصيرة المدى بنسبة 100% في عام 2025، مما أدى إلى مقتل 580 مدني. وفي هذا الإطار تود مملكة البحرين استمرار الهجمات بالصواريخ البالستية والطائرات المسيرة التي تشنها الجمهورية الإسلامية الإيرانية ضد بلاد مملكة البحرين والدول مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية والمملكة الأردنية الهاشمية وعدد من دول المنطقة. كان مجلس الأمن بأشد العبارات في قراره رقم 2017 بتاريخ 11 من مارس 2026 والذي رعته 136 دولة تلك الهجمات الغاشمة، وطالب إيران بوقفها فوراً، مما يعكس التضامن الدولي مع دولنا تجاه الاعتداءات الإيرانية السافرة التي تعرض حياة المدنيين للخطر وتهدد السلم والأمن الإقليميين والدوليين. ثالثاً، تؤكد مملكة البحرين على أهمية الجهود المبذولة من الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية في تيسير المفاوضات الدبلوماسية بين الجانبين الروسي والأوكراني، بالإضافة إلى دور المملكة العربية السعودية ودولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة ودولة قطر في الوساطة السياسية. وتتطلع مملكة البحرين أن تسفر المفاوضات بين الجانبين عن نتائج ملموسة للتوصل إلى حل سلمي ومستدام للحرب في أوكرانيا، حيث أن المفاوضات والحوارات الدبلوماسية هي الحل الوحيد القادر على تحقيق الأمن والسلام في القارة الأوروبية. وفي هذا السياق تقدر مملكة البحرين جهود كافة الدول التي تبذل جهدا في التوسط من أجل الأمن والسلم والاستقرار، وتسهم في تجنب تصعيد الأزمات في محاولة لإيجاد حل دبلوماسي لها. في الختام، السيد الرئيس، أصبح من الضروري دعم العمل الجاد لإنهاء الحرب في أوكرانيا وإحلال السلام المستدام مع تخفيف تداعياتها الإنسانية بما ينسجم مع مبادئ القانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة وقرار مجلس الأمن رقم 2704. وشكرا السيد الرئيس.
I thank the representative of Bahrain for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, I wish to thank the U.S. Presidency for convening this meeting and you, Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau, for chairing it. It is a powerful signal that shows the importance that the U.S. government attaches to Ukraine. I'm also grateful to the delegations of Greece, Latvia, France, and the United Kingdom for supporting Ukraine's request. I'm further thankful to the distinguished briefers, Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and Under-Secretary General Tom Fletcher, for their eye-opening and powerful briefings. I have no doubt that sooner than some may expect, all the shocking facts that we just heard from the UN Secretariat will serve as evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity, which Russia has been committing during its full-scale military of Ukraine. We commend the indispensable work of the UN institutions in Ukraine and call upon the member states to help finance the humanitarian needs. We all heard an appeal of UN Emergency Relief Coordinator USG Fletcher. Mr. President, before I proceed with my statement, I want to briefly react to the allegations of the representative of Russia about the supposed suffering of Russian people, even though he escaped the chamber. Listening to all those fantasies, one might get an impression that it is Ukraine that invaded poor Russia and not vice versa. George Orwell would turn in his grave. As noted by USG DiCarlo, all these baseless claims of alleged Russian victims cannot be verified. So my response to you is very simple, and I would say it in Russian: прекратите ныть и лгать, и просто убирайтесь из Украины. Just stop whining and lying and get out of Ukraine. Mr. President, we are all seeing the disturbing developments in the Middle East. Ukraine expresses its condolences to the victims of Iran's missile and drone attacks against the countries in the region and deeply deplores these treacherous strikes. That is why Ukraine became one of the first co-sponsors of the Security Council Resolution 2817, adopted 2 weeks ago, condemning these attacks against the Gulf countries and Jordan. Moreover, our solidarity was not just words. In the very first days, Ukraine sent hundreds of experts who are already on the ground helping our partners in the region to counter aerial threats and intercept deadly Iranian drones. Mr. President, even though Russia did not dare to veto this resolution, what we've seen in the last weeks is that it is Moscow that has been providing substantial military support to the Tehran regime. It is Russia that is not just the principal ally of Iran, but the main accomplice and co-perpetrator of unlawful attacks against civilian infrastructure of the Gulf states. Russia has long portrayed itself as a big friend of the global South, opposing the vicious West, but this narrative collapses under the weight of the real actions of Moscow, helping Iran to ruin oil and gas production facilities in the region. Russia does not care about the global South. It has actually betrayed it. The Kremlin is not just providing Tehran with intelligence support, including satellite imagery and other crucial data that facilitate targeting of US military assets across the Middle East. There is, moreover, enough evidence that Russia is now transferring modernized Shahed-type drones to Iran, drawing on its own production capabilities based on licensed Iranian designs. The same Shahed drones that Tehran was sending to Moscow since the beginning of the war, 2022, to murder Ukrainian civilians are now produced in Russia and sent back both to destroy oil and gas infrastructure as the backbone of the economy in the Gulf state and to kill American soldiers. This is an unprecedented escalation in the region that may cost countless lives. Earlier this year, Russia reportedly transferred attack helicopters to Iran in apparent violation of relevant UN arms restrictions. But the massive production of Russian drones and the provision to the Tehran regime elevates this conspiracy to a new level. Mr. President, this axis of evil between Moscow and Tehran constitutes an enormous threat to international security. Their military cooperation is truly alarming. The United States and the international community must take this threat seriously and act before it is too late. With those Russian drones, the Tehran regime will be capable of waging this war for a very long period, destabilizing not just the region, but the whole global economy. This means that production sites of Russian drones should be considered legitimate targets for military strikes in the campaign against the mullah regime. Ukraine is already contributing to the weakening of the military potential of Moscow-Tehran unholy alliance, as our troops are hitting these production facilities, exercising the right of self-defense. So providing Ukraine with the means for deep strikes and helping ramp up our domestic production of long-range missiles would support collective efforts to bring peace to the Middle East. And my last point on Russia's hidden role in destabilizing the whole region. In reality, Russia is the primary beneficiary of the new wave of instability in the Middle East. First, it automatically diverts global attention away from its ongoing aggression against Ukraine. Second, the massive deployment of air defense systems is already creating shortages on the international markets. And third, and most critically, rising oil and gas prices are generating extraordinary windfall revenues for Russia. Estimates suggest that In March alone, Russia may earn an additional $10 billion from energy exports. That is why we call upon our allies to impose additional sanctions on Russian oil and gas to deprive Moscow of these profits that fuel not only its war against Ukraine, but also undermine global security and claim lives, including those of American servicemen. Mr. President, while the world's attention shifts, we must not allow Russia's war against Ukraine to be overshadowed and to fade into the background. The recent conflict in Iran has revealed how intertwined this crisis is with Russia's military invasion and the Kremlin's malign imperialistic goals. There shall be no illusion. This Russian war of annihilation against Ukrainian statehood continues with relentless brutality. This winter was the deadliest for the civilian population since February 22. Over the last 3 months alone, Russia launched nearly 19,000 strike drones, more than 14,600 guided bombs, and around 800 missiles. Russia sought to plunge Ukraine into total blackout, to fully destroy our critical infrastructure and break the resistance of our people. But even though the suffering of civilians and the level of devastation are huge, Russia has failed to achieve this perfidious goal. According to recent polls, Ukrainians do not even consider giving up. I will translate it into Russian language again. Не дождетесь. Don't hold your breath. Mr. President, what we are witnessing is a carefully staged performance that Russia continues to play. On the one hand, the war situation for the Kremlin is increasingly bleak on the battlefield, and yet Moscow keeps on puffing up its greatness, pretending to be invincible and projecting the image of being one step away from total victory and Ukraine's supposed capitulation. As the Institute for the Study of War, an independent think tank, rightly pointed out a few days ago, Putin's negotiating position is based on a bluff and a lie. The bluff is that the Russians will overwhelm Ukraine and take what they want anyway, and the lie is that Mr. Putin will be satisfied with less than what he continually demands, namely a de facto surrender of Ukraine. This Russian claim of inevitability of its triumph is a myth, and I will briefly explain why. Russia has failed to achieve any of the goals of its full-scale military invasion. We are dealing with the longest 3-day blitzkrieg in human history, dragging on for over 4 years now. Let us take a closer look at the situation on the front line. Russian forces occupy now 19.4% of Ukrainian territory. They had taken about 7% during the first phase of the war, back in 2014, and came to occupy a total of 26.8% shortly after the full-scale invasion began in 22. Subsequent Ukrainian counteroffensives left the Russians holding only about 17.9% of Ukrainian soil in November 22. So, since then, since autumn 22, Russia has seized only 1.5% more Ukrainian land while suffering over 1.2 million casualties in total. Just think about it for a moment. Russian troops, the self-proclaimed second army in the world, have needed 3.5 years to occupy 9,300 square kilometers, an area 3 times the size of Rhode Island. Putin's allegedly inexorable march to victory has been proceeding more slowly than a turtle's pace, and at the current speed, it would take 183 years to occupy the whole territory of Ukraine. I repeat, we'll need 183 years. It doesn't really sound like a successful blitzkrieg for Moscow, does it? That is exactly the reason why Putin demands that Ukraine abandon, without a fight, territories in the Donetsk region that Moscow have failed to occupy over 12 years of its aggression. By turning such ultimatums into preconditions for negotiations, as we have seen, Russia is deliberately obstructing the peace process. That is one of the biggest stumbling blocks on the way to a peaceful resolution. Russia has simultaneously invented other unresolvable dilemmas, both demanding that Ukraine hold elections as a condition for a final peace settlement, while refusing at the same time the ceasefire which is needed for such elections. Russia must stop playing these games. We call upon the United States as a mediator, as the only mediator, to make clear to the Russians that these tricks are doomed to fail. By the way, in months, Ukrainian troops have broken the dynamics of war and begun to push Russian forces back. In February alone, the Ukrainian army liberated a territory the combined size of Queens and Brooklyn in Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions. So from the military point of view, Russia is not winning the war, and it is an obvious fact. The second reason why Putin is failing in Ukraine is because of the deteriorating economic situation in Russia that I described in detail when I was honored to speak before this council last time in January. This Monday, even Putin himself, with a visibly subdued expression, acknowledged the grave state of Russia's economy. Just watch this video to see his long face. It is priceless. Zero growth, zero reserves, increasing budget deficit, and many other factors make more and more difficult for Russia to finance the war against Ukraine and pay the salary to its soldiers. The war in Iran and growing prices for oil and gas can, however, become a saving grace and a new lifeline for the Russian war machinery. Putin will be clutching at straws, trying to use this chaos in the Middle East as a game changer. We cannot allow it to happen. Thus, we appeal to our friends, to our allies, to the United States to reintroduce sanctions against Russian energy resources as soon as possible and tighten the screws on Moscow. We also call upon other member states who used to be the biggest buyers of Russian oil and gas and diesel to stop exporting them and stop filling Kremlin's war chest and bankrolling its aggression. Mr. President, the only domain in which Russia is regrettably succeeding is in inflicting suffering to the Ukrainian people. Every day, civilians are murdered, both in areas near the front lines and deep within Ukraine, as a result of daily drone and missile attacks. We have just heard the shocking figures of the numbers of victims during the briefing of USG DiCarlo. I will not repeat them. They still echo in our ears. The medieval era brutality that we see as Russia wages this war against Ukraine must be stopped. Mr. President, irrespective of Russian tricks, abusing diplomacy as a tool of delay aimed at gambling on reduced international support for Kiev, we remain fully committed to the restoration of peace. Ukraine never was and will never be an obstacle to a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. We will spare no efforts to continue negotiations under the US leadership towards this goal. Mr. President, before I wrap up, allow me to address one final point. At our previous meeting, the representative of Russia once again recycled a familiar narrative about an alleged historical unity between Ukrainians and Russians. He even muttered something about Kievan Rus under his breath that we Ukrainians had sold for 30 pieces of silver. Let me set the historical record straight once and for all. In the beginning of the 12th century, Kiev was the capital of the largest and one of the most powerful states in medieval Europe. In those times, the area of present-day Moscow was nothing more than a swamp where only frogs were croaking. It was in 1147 that a tiny settlement on the edge of the known political world was first mentioned that later would develop into Moscow. And it was under the powerful reign of the Grand Princess of Kiev that Moscow was founded. And then it was Andrei Boголюbsky, the ruler of Vladimir Suzdal, today's Russia, whose troops plundered Kiev back in 1169, murdered its citizens, and looted the city's treasures with a ferocity which is reminiscent of the barbarian sackings of ancient Rome. So let us be honest, it was Moscow that betrayed Kiev. It is Moscow that continues the same brutal policy to this day, bombing Kiev, destroying our Golden Dome churches, raping and killing civilians. So, I would like to address our Russian colleagues. Ukrainians do not need your distorted historical lessons about imagined unity. It's like they're lecturing the chicken. At the cradle of the Ukrainian statehood, Kiev had stood firm for more than 1,000 years, and it will stand for 1,000 more. It will flourish, it will be unconquered, and Russia will fail to subjugate it. So let me address you again in your own language that serves as a reminder of Russian colonial legacy. Закончен бал, потухли свечи. Бери шинель, иди домой. The carnival is over, the candles are out. Take your trench coats and get out of Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
President, I'm making this statement on behalf of, and let me start by thanking the briefers, USG DiCarlo and USG Fletcher, for their valuable inputs to this timely Security Council briefing today. Just last month, we marked the 4th anniversary of Russia's full-scale aggression. However, Russia's war against Ukraine did not begin then. This month marks 12 years since the illegal annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation, following an illegal and illegitimate so-called referendum, as well as the start of Russia's armed aggression in eastern Ukraine. More than 12 years ago, Russia's killing of innocent Ukrainian civilians began, unlawfully and indiscriminately. Since then, it has not stopped. According to the United Nations, more than 15,000 civilians have been killed and over 41,000 injured in Ukraine since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. The true toll is undoubtedly higher, including victims since March 2014, the full extent of which remains unclear. Russia's killings continues. These attacks target civilians and civilian infrastructure, and they are clear violation of international law and cannot be justified or explained under any circumstances. This killing has come at a significant cost for Russia. According to publicly available sources, Russia's battlefield losses are estimated at approximately 1,315,000 soldiers since the start of its full-scale invasion in 2022, including both killed and seriously wounded. Even these figures likely underestimate the true staggering scale of Russia's losses. However, Russia has not lost only soldiers and military equipment. It has also lost credibility, honor, and international standing. Russia's aggression is totally incompatible not only with the status and responsibility of a permanent member of the Security Council, but also with those of any United Nations member states. Its full-scale aggression against Ukraine constitutes one of the most serious violations of the United Nations Charter and international law, amounting to the crime of aggression and accompanied by widespread war crimes. It represents the gravest threat to European and global security since the Second World War. We call on all states to support and join the initiative to establish a special tribunal on the crime of aggression as a necessary step to reinforce the international law-based multilateral system and ensure that impunity does not prevail. Less than 2 weeks ago, the Independent International Commission on Ukraine, established by the United Nations Human Rights Council, published a deeply disturbing report concluding that the systematic deportation and transfer of Ukrainian children by Russian authorities may amount to crimes against humanity. The continuation of this war solely on Russia's choices. It can cease its military actions immediately and engage in genuine good faith negotiations focused on the full withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine, compensation for the damage caused, and accountability for those responsible, rather than the insincere processes we have seen for far too long. President, we must collectively apply maximum pressure on Russia to end its aggression and engage in a just and lasting peace. This must be grounded in the UN Charter and international law, including the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. We reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. The occupation of any part of Ukraine will never be recognized by the international community. The Baltic states stand firmly with Ukraine because defending Ukraine means defending the ironclad principles of the UN Charter, including sovereign equality of states, as well as the respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of all member states. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Allow me to begin by thanking you, Mr. President, and the U.S. Presidency for convening this meeting, and also warm thanks to Undersecretary Generals DiCarlo and Fletcher for their important, even if chilling, updates. Russia's disastrous war of aggression has now entered its 5th year. Almost 1,500 days have passed in which Russia has subjected Ukraine and its citizens to a brutal aggression, a violation of the UN Charter which has repeatedly been condemned by the UN General Assembly. But Russia's statement in this chamber continued to blame others and to float incredible, often self-contradictory justifications for the unjustifiable. Colleagues, we rarely hear about the toll of this war on Russians themselves. Russia's leaders would certainly not want their citizens to know. Its forces have reportedly suffered approximately 1.2 million casualties since 2022, with as many as 325,000 killed. What a staggering lack of respect for human life. And yet, it has not achieved military objectives and struggles to hold the territory it has captured. And frustrated by its lack of progress on the battleground, Russia continues to deliberately target Ukrainian civilians. That's an easier target, isn't it? Their energy, their heating, their water, their hospitals, their schools, their residences, their lives. In February alone, Russia targeted Ukrainian cities with almost 300 missiles and over 5,000 drones. The highest numbers, I stress, since it started a systematic campaign against Ukrainian civilians 4 years ago. The OHCHR has verified at least 188 civilian deaths in February as a result of Russia's attacks, adding to the over 15,000 verified civilian deaths Russia is responsible for. Without the successful interception rate of Ukrainian air defenses, civilian casualties would have been even higher. Intentionally attacking civilians and civilian objects is a war crime, as if anyone needed to remind this in this chamber, and perpetrators will face justice and will be held accountable. We commend the resilience of the Ukrainian people to stand firm in defense of their country and stand up for the UN Charter. Colleagues, according to UNICEF, over a third of Ukrainian children remain displaced as a result of Russia's aggression. I recall the decision of the General Assembly last December to redouble efforts to return Ukrainian children who have been unlawfully deported and forcibly transferred to Russia, and we look forward to hearing from the UN about its efforts to this end. For those still in doubt about whether this is important, I refer to the comprehensive new report by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry that presents further damning evidence of Russia's obstruction of the return of Ukrainian children. The Commission concludes that Russia's actions amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes. The Commission concludes that. We're also deeply alarmed by its findings that nationals from Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia are recruited by Russia to fight in Ukraine, often lured by false pretenses. Colleagues, in coordination with our allies, the European Union will continue to provide comprehensive political, financial, economic, humanitarian, military, and diplomatic support to Ukraine and its people in line with their inherent right to self-defense, according to Article 51 of the UN Charter. At the same time, the European Union continues to focus on achieving an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire and a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in line with international law, including the UN Charter. The General Assembly has spoken out very clearly in this regard, very recently in this regard. The EU will sustain its diplomatic efforts with Ukraine, together with the United States and other partners. From its side, Ukraine has repeatedly stated its readiness for an immediate ceasefire. Meanwhile, Russia continues to pursue its maximalist tactics and claims. We call on all members of this Council to join us in urging Russia, indeed, in supplying sustained diplomatic pressure on Russia to stop pretending and to engage in meaningful negotiations. Third countries that enable Russia's aggression must also stop doing so. Iran, Belarus, the DPRK must halt the military support, and all countries, including members of this Council, must cease any and all direct and indirect assistance to Russia. We welcome Ukraine's readiness to provide support and expertise in air defense and counter-drone systems to Gulf countries. This is based, of course, on its own experience of being systematically subjected to Russian attacks by Iranian Shahed drones. President, in conclusion, I reiterate the European support to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. No country can annex its neighbor. No can be changed by force. It is time for Russia to stop the killing and engage in meaningful talks in order to achieve a just and lasting peace. Enough is enough. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Lambrinidis, for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Finland.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I would like to join the others in thanking Undersecretary General DiCarlo and Undersecretary General Fletcher for their very important briefings today. I have the honor to address the Council on behalf of the Nordic countries, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Finland. Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine is continuing for the 5th year with the publicly and openly declared intention to grab territory from an independent neighboring country and annex it for good. The war has resulted in over 15,000 civilian deaths, not to mention the total human toll and economic and environmental costs of the invasion, some of them global. All this destruction caused by unlawful invasion, as pointless as it was over 4 years ago. The Nordic countries have stated this before, and I reiterate. The Russian Federation could end this war today, its troops home. We regret that the political will to stop the aggression is still lacking after more than 4 years. Mr. President, despite this grim backdrop, there is ground for hope. First, Russia's war of aggression is not progressing according to the aggressor's plans. What was initially portrayed as a 3-day operation has now lasted for over 4 years. Russia has lost a staggering amount of both personnel and military material. At the same time, the Ukrainian resilience has remained remarkable. The invading Russia even pushed back in some parts of the front line. It is obvious that Russia is failing to meet its objectives on the battleground. Second, there have been several serious initiatives to promote peace. These discussions need to continue and gain momentum. The Nordic countries appreciate all the good efforts made by the United States and others in this regard. Regrettably, we are yet to see the Russian Federation engage in a genuine and meaningful manner. Third, significant progress has been made to establish a robust accountability framework. International courts and tribunals are playing a substantial role, with ICC investigations and ICJ proceedings moving forward. The Nordic countries are committed to the ongoing work of the Register of Damage for Ukraine and stand firmly behind the establishment of the Claims Commission and the Special Tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Fourth, spring is coming. Ukrainians have made it through another gruesome winter, battling the bitter freezing cold that is caused by Russia's attacks against energy infrastructure. Intentional attacks against civilian infrastructure, including energy facilities, amount to war crimes. A clear objective behind Russia's unlawful means and methods of warfare is to overcome Ukraine's civilian resilience. Yet again, Ukraine has prevailed. Furthermore, Ukraine's international partners are there to support it in preparing also for the next winter. Russia, as one of the 5 permanent members of this Council, has a particular responsibility to uphold the UN Charter and its core principles of territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence. Instead, Russia continues to blatantly violate the UN Charter and its core principles. In closing, Mr. President, the Nordic countries reiterate our unwavering support for Ukraine and for a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in line with international law, including the United Nations Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Finland for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, at the outset, I thank the United States of America and you personally for convening this meeting, and the briefers, the USG DiCarlo and Tom Fletcher, for their informative interventions. Mr. President, the brave Ukrainian society endured a very harsh winter while Russia fiercely attacked civilians and the critical infrastructure. The humanitarian situation, although, remains critical, as we heard. During the most freezing temperatures, the Polish authorities and the NGOs sent hundreds of power generators to Kiev and other cities to alleviate this huge humanitarian crisis. This is our concrete effort you ask for, alongside with hosting the more than 1 million of the Ukrainian peace, to bring peace to this war. Because there will be no peace unless the Ukraine and Ukrainians will survive and will be saved from this aggression. Because there's only one aggressor and one victim. While global attention has partially shifted due to the crisis in the Middle East, the intensity of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has not diminished. We are aware that Russia is attempting to exploit the situation and to advance its own agenda. The drones currently striking the Gulf countries are very much the same as the one that's supplied by Iran to Russia and vice versa, for use on its aggression against Ukraine. States of both regions should clearly see that, and that Russia and Iran share a strategy characterized by aggressive stance and unprovoked indiscriminate attacks against their neighbors, including strikes targeting residential areas and civilian infrastructure. Their conduct deserves the condemnation of the international community. Mr. President, in Ukraine, with improving weather conditions, further escalation along the front line can be expected. Drones and missiles continue to target civilian infrastructure as part of Russia's war of attrition. And Moscow does not stop there. Poland has observed a campaign organized by Russia to recruit individuals from Africa who are subsequently deployed to the front lines against Ukraine. In many cases, these individuals are unaware that they will be participating directly in the hostilities. Russia is exploiting vulnerable populations from different regions around the world, often taking advantage of their difficult economic conditions by offering deceptive employment opportunities. These people and their families are becoming victims of Moscow's policy, which is an example of the worst neo-colonial practices. Mr. President, recalling the historic session of this Council, chaired by the US First Lady and devoted to the crisis facing children in war zones, we wish to condemn the grave violations of the children's rights caused by Russia's aggression. Hundreds of children have been killed, thousands injured, and many forcibly displaced, often separated from their families. Education are having long-term consequences for an entire generation. Particularly alarming are the unlawful transfer and deportation of Ukrainian children, which we firmly condemn and call to be immediately reversed. Mr. President, Poland supports peace efforts. However, it must be noted that while Ukraine has demonstrated readiness to pursue diplomatic solutions, Russia has shown no credible willingness to engage in meaningful negotiations and continues to escalate hostilities. Therefore, we must remain unused support to Ukraine, including military and financial assistance, while increasing pressure on Russia. We call for further means targeting Russia's war economy and for additional measures to restrict the shadow fleet, which provides critical revenue to the Russian budget. Mr. President, to conclude, to break the Russian pattern of aggression, we need to ensure full accountability for all violations of international law committed in Ukraine. Those responsible must be brought to justice, and impunity cannot be allowed to prevail. We need unity within the international community, including with this Council, in upholding the principles of the UN Charter. Any path to peace must be based on a full respect for the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine within these internationally recognized borders. Poland reaffirms its unwavering support for Ukraine and its people. We call for sustained international support and safe, unimpeded humanitarian access to all those in need. We will stand in solidarity with Ukraine, as you know, solidarity means a lot to Poles. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.